I'm in complete agreement with what you said about how people's rights shouldn't be put to a vote in a referendum. Have you come across any arguments that have been very persuasive for politicians as to why they should legislate for equality rather than backslide and hide behind the idea that we need a referendum?
Right. Well, again, let me just start with a disclaimer that I'm no expert in the Irish Constitution. I haven't read all the Irish case law. I would hardly pretend to know the political scene all that well. I certainly look to leaders in groups like Glenn and Marriage Equality and others to really do the good analysis and the good engagement. Having said that, they gave me a lot of homework before I came here, and I read everything that everybody sent me. And I was just struck by the absence of any solid analysis as to why the Constitution, even as it's written today, would be seen to bar the political leadership from doing the job. And to be a little more specific, I read the text of the Constitution with regard to this. I believe it's Article 41 or Section 41. And it talks about the government's responsibility to defend, in furtherance of the family, to defend the family and to defend marriage. And so my two reactions to that are, okay, number one, if you look literally at what's written, it doesn't in any way restrict or exclude gay people from marriage. So if you really want to dig deep into the Constitution and somehow insist that the views of 1937 or whenever are somehow fixed in time and not organic and not progressive and not to be understood to relate to the current times and shifts of understanding and so on, in 1937, they did not bar gay people from marriage in the Constitution. Whatever was being done as a practice, that was not in the Constitution. So the text of the Constitution itself says nothing to bar the way from the responsible political leadership to do the right thing with regard to ending denial of marriage. And just as I believe the age of consent for marriage in 1937 was 12 or 14 or what have you, and now presumably it's older, and that was allowed to happen without a referendum because it was deemed to be the government's proper role of regulating, protecting, and governing marriage. So in this case, the government ought to have the ability to do their job here. The other point I would make, and again, I will defer to experts who will obviously take this up and have to really think it through, is where's the attack? How do gay people seeking to marry constitute an attack on marriage or the family? To the contrary, it's an attack on marriage to take committed couples who have now been acknowledged to have existence and vulnerabilities and needs, and to create other legal mechanisms and other contortions that would shove them outside of the legal institution of marriage rather than bring them in on equal footing. And when they come in on equal footing, it takes nothing away from anyone else. It's not like the gays are going to use up all the marriage licenses. And it's not going to deter anyone else from getting married. There's not going to be longer lines that keep marriage from happening on the part of non-gay Irish people. So where's the attack? The attack that's occurring here is the attack on families, the attack on children, and it's coming in the form of government discrimination and mandated vulnerability in a way that the political leadership ought to be able to address. And so I would, if I were consulting with you all, as apparently I am, I would take up that question and those arguments and look for a solid, serious legal answer before just accepting as a given the casual assertion that there needs to be a referendum.
Jean-Philippe.
Hello. When you were doing your homework coming over, what were your views on the powers of the church in the readings that you have done as regards marriage equality and all that?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'm not an expert, but this is a society that has a constitution and has a political structure that is founded on the notion that all people are equal, that there are basic rights and protections that are guaranteed to all, that the law operates to serve everyone, and that the church, as an important institution, as something very meaningful to many people, of course, is also protected and respected in the law, but doesn't run the government.
Question here. Hi. In the UK, there's a growing group of individuals who are in opposite sex relationships but want their relationship to be acknowledged through the institution of civil partnership. I just wondered whether you feel that that is a help or a hindrance to gay and lesbian partners having the right to the institution of marriage.
I think it depends on how the case is made, but in general, I believe that when government creates a legal status, whether it be marriage or civil partnership, domestic partnership, civil union, registries, and so on, the government should not be discriminating on the basis of sex or sexual orientation. And so if the government creates something called civil partnership, it ought to be open to all. And if the government creates something called marriage, as it has, it ought to be open to all. And people should have to qualify for those statuses based on things that actually show connection to the institution and are legitimate, not carved into separate groups and denied something because of their sex or their sexual orientation or the sex or the sexual orientation of the person they love.
Are there any more questions?
And actually, I'll come back to your question then while people are thinking of more questions, which is to, let me add also the notion that the best way to protect religious freedom is by respecting the proper boundaries and spheres of the church and of the state. The worst thing that can happen to religious freedom is for the government to be so entwined with one religion, any one religion, that it starts being used as a weapon to impose views, because we all know from our own history, whether in Ireland or in the United States or many other countries that are still laboring under the failure to achieve the legal balance that we have in our constitutions, that the entwinement, the improper entwinement of church and state leads to religious warfare and political instability and lessened freedom and lessened security for everybody. Whereas respecting the proper boundaries of church and state is the best way to preserve not just personal freedom, but religious freedom. And so in this instance, I would say that government, whether in Ireland or the United States, has no business telling the church who it must marry. That's up to each church, temple, synagogue, or mosque to decide for itself. But no church should be telling the government, should be dictating who can get a city hall marriage license. And just as, correct me if I'm wrong, here in Ireland, after a long struggle, you would not allow a priest to call over to City Hall and say, don't give that divorced couple a marriage license because we don't agree with them. So the priest should not be able to call down to City Hall and say, don't give that gay couple a marriage license because we don't like them. Government can't call over to the church and say, and you have to hold the wedding. And that's how we protect both. And that's what we should be doing in the United States and in Ireland.
Might be a bit of a cheeky question, but I'm just wondering, on your return back to the States, is there anything from the experience in Ireland you think that you've learned from that you can bring back to the States?
Well, first of all, I'll just say I've always actually wanted to come here, and it's been really great to get to meet people, and thanks to Marriage Equality's jam-packing my schedule, I've been able to actually meet a lot of people, which has really been great, and they also gave me a little sightseeing time, so I've had a taste of Trinity College and Belfast and the Giant's Causeway and the beauty of Ireland. So that's been terrific, but I guess the thing I would take back is the reaffirmation that even in a society that has, at least from the outside, been seen to be, for much of its history, traditional, conservative, church-dominated, hostile, you can make tremendous change, as you have. And that is important for us in the United States, because while we've made tremendous progress and really moved things along, there are definitely large areas of the country where people will say exactly the same things as many of you might have said to each other, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or may, in some cases, be worrying about today, that, in this economic climate, we can't do it, or we've hit the wall as far as we can go, or the church is going to be too strong and monolithically opposed, or what have you. And I think the lesson that we can give each other in these kinds of conversations is that that's just not true. We can change things, we have changed things, we are changing things, and we must change things.
Sorry, just another question about your last point in relation to the church and state remaining isolated from each other, not encroaching on each other. In the UK at the minute you had a bit of a backlash with religious orders who are involved with adoption agencies. I was wondering what your views on that kind of point would be, about how you navigate that murky kind of grey area.
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is that one of my heroes, Martin Luther King, once wrote, "I hate the word backlash," he said, because backlash implies that those of us who favor equality, went too far or did something wrong, and now the others have risen up. When in fact, the truth of it is, there is tremendous inequality, tremendous tension, and a conflicting set of views as to what kind of society we should have, and we are working to make the change as they are fighting to impose their vision on society through their weaponry. And that's what's really going on. So I don't like to think of it as a backlash. I like to think of it as there's inequality, there's injustice, there's denial, there's discrimination, and we're working to make a better society, and other people have a different idea of what kind of society ought to be. The other point, though, is that sadly, in the Catholic Church, in the hierarchy, as distinguished from the vast majority of Catholics, there has been a deepening of hostility to gay people and to gay equality. And we've seen that in the United States. I can't speak for Ireland, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's here as well, because I think it's all coming out of a central shift in the part of a particular faction of the Catholic hierarchy now in ascendancy. And one of the tools they've been using is where they've been unable to persuade political leadership to continue discrimination, they've started trying essentially to hold things we all care about hostage. So they've, after being in the adoption business for decades or more, and operating under anti-discrimination laws that prohibited the arbitrary denial of adoption to qualified gay parents in places like Massachusetts or the District of Columbia. Again, I'm not an expert in Ireland, but in those places, the Catholic adoption agencies, like others, have functioned and have had gay couples adopt because it's in the best interest of the children. As part of their rearguard attack on gay people's freedom to marry, the hierarchy has forced those agencies, against the will of their own boards, in case of, for example, of Massachusetts, to try to now claim that they, because of marriage, because of this momentum, they have to stop adopting because they can no longer abide by the rules that say that children should be given to qualified parents rather than discrimination arbitrarily repeated. And to my mind, it's a very sad political and PR tactic that really won't serve the church and certainly doesn't serve children very well. And we just have to address it with calm and reason and pointing to what's really happening here, which is that their position would deny children loving homes. And that's wrong. And if they want state money to perform a state function, then they ought to abide by the rules of non-discrimination and respect that obtain in the public sphere. If they want to be on their own, doing their own thing, then of course they should have the choice to do that, but that should not be laid at the doorstep of anyone else. That's the choice they make. Again, under a free set of rules that strike the right balance between church and state. And again, the bottom line is, every child welfare association actually says it's in the interest of children to be raised by loving, committed parents. Everyone says that gay parents are fit and loving, that the children being raised by gay parents grow up just as happy, just as healthy, just as well adjusted, and for that matter, just as gay or non-gay as the children being raised by non-gay parents. So if people really care about the children, they ought to do what's right for the children. And what's right for the children is to make sure that the homes they are in have all the support and all the well-being and all the protection we can possibly give them. It doesn't do any kid any good for the state to punish the kid for having the, quote, wrong kind of parents by withholding legal protections and responsibilities.
Evan, hello, Brian Sheehan from Glen.
Hello.
Thanks very much for your thoughts. Very, very interesting and very useful food for thought. A question about the states. With the interplay of the Supreme Court, the federal government and 50 state governments, where do you think marriage equality is going to come? In your best guesstimate, where is it going to come from in the states?
Right. Well, on our website, Freedom to Marry's website, freedomtomarry.org, we have what we believe to be the strategy that will bring the whole thing together and get to what I would call national resolution. In other words, finishing the job in the national level. I already talked about how our legal structures are different. We don't have one marriage law governed by the federal government. That's not the way it works in the states. We have 50 sets of marriage laws that then are either respected or not respected by the federal government. So in order to get to nationwide resolution or national resolution in the United States, if you look at the lessons of history and you look at other social justice movements and others who've struggled against discrimination, it's clear that one of two actors will have to finish the job, Congress or the Supreme Court. They will finish the job after what I call in my book, Why Marriage Matters, a patchwork of struggle. And again, this is more relevant for the United States than necessarily for you, in which some states will move to equality faster while others resist or even regress. They get worse before they get better. And that's the character of political struggle and legal change in the United States. And after this patchwork, you see, excuse me, at some point, a critical mass of states that have moved in the right direction and a critical mass of public opinion that have created the climate that inspires judges and/or political figures to do their job. Now, what the critical mass is exactly, no one can tell you with mathematical precision. If you take as a measure, not a formula, but an example, a similar struggle in which we worked to end race restrictions on who could marry whom, something that still occurred in the United States in the lifetime of most of us in this room. If you look at that as a measure, when the challenge to race restrictions on marriage came before the United States Supreme Court in 1967, the court having gotten it wrong previously, and now it came again in the best named case ever, Loving versus Virginia. Came to the United States Supreme Court. At that point, 2/3 of the states had ended race restrictions in marriage in a struggle that had lasted centuries, and that included a civil war, right? But still 16 states excluded people from marrying someone of, quote unquote, the wrong race. So if you look at that as a measure, we have a lot more work to do because we, as I've told you, we have 5 states in the District of Columbia. Now again, it's not a formula, but it does suggest that we have more work to do in building truly the critical mass that will get us there. The other critical mass is the critical mass of public opinion. When that case came before the US Supreme Court in 1967, polls showed 70% of the American people opposed interracial marriage. But the court did not put its finger to the wind. It did its job. And it struck down race restrictions and moved forward. So if you look at that critical mass, that measure, we're doing much better. As I told you earlier, we've just hit this milestone of majority support. We're working hard to grow and diversify that majority, and that will happen as we make it more real in more states, and as more leadership comes from countries like Ireland and Argentina and Spain and Portugal and South Africa and the others that have moved in the right direction. All of that will help those 2 sets of critical mass in some interplay set the climate for that political change. And as I said, it'll either come from the court or it'll come from Congress after this patchwork using and building this critical mass. So on our website, Freedom to Marry's website, we have what we call the roadmap to victory. And it's the call to action for all the different organizations and all people, non-gay as well as gay, who want to be part of this movement to end discrimination. And the roadmap has 3 tracks of work that have to be done synergistically, not sequentially. They all reinforce each other. And the plan of action of our campaign, the roadmap, is win more states, grow the majority for marriage, and tackle and end federal discrimination. Now, the way to tackle and end federal discrimination is, as I've said, either by moving a bill through Congress or by bringing a case and winning at the Supreme Court. There already is, as you probably know, a set of cases now making their way up to the Supreme Court. Most of them, and I should say that even though a case heads to the Supreme Court, as lawyers know, there are many twists in the road, and cases can sometimes make it, sometimes not, when they make it, how they make it, whether they make it, who the judges are when they get there. All of those things are things we don't know, despite the bravado of the attorneys when they file a case or hit a round. So the majority of those cases that are making their way to the United States Supreme Court now, many at the lower level, a couple were just filed last week, some are now at the appellate level, involve challenges to the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, the federal discriminatory law. That federal law does not prohibit gay people from getting married. It says that even when they are married in a place like Massachusetts or Connecticut or Iowa, even when they're legally married, the federal government will discriminate against those families for federal purposes, such as Social Security or immigration and so on. So that federal overlay of discrimination is now being challenged in most of those cases. One other case that you, I'm sure, have read some about is the case in California. And that's a case that's not a challenge to the federal law. It's a challenge to California's discrimination in stripping away the right to marry from loving, committed couples who the court had previously said deserve it and should have it. That also is now in the federal appellate court. It may or may not go to the Supreme Court. And that involves that threshold question of whether a state may deny the marriage licenses in the first place. So some mix of those cases may or may not get to the Supreme Court. And that may or may not lead to a ruling that may or may not address just the federal piece or the full denial of marriage at both levels of government, state and federal. So on the assumption that we're operating under the Supreme Court urgency and time clock, though we may not be, but we have to act as if we are, Freedom to Marry has this roadmap, and our goal is very much to create that critical mass of public opinion and a critical mass of states by these 3 tracks of work, or by creating the climate and sufficient momentum in the states and the pieces, the victory in the pieces, state by state, that I just described, all of which is grist for creating the climate, that we will get to nationwide resolution. My hope is to do it with what I call 2020 vision, to do it by the year 2020, and it could be sooner, depending on how well we succeed and the inspiration and help we have from places like Ireland.
Thank you so much. Again, Evan, I had the privilege of being with you the other day, and your presentation today reconfirms your extraordinary expertise in this whole area.
Thank you.
And indeed the complexity of what we're dealing with. If I may, I would just like to bring us back for a moment to the conversation we were having earlier about not just the church-state complexity in Ireland and that relationship, but bringing it back to the question of education and children. Something in Ireland that isn't perhaps known worldwide is that our schools in Ireland, our state schools, are at primary level for 8 years up to 12, controlled 95% by the Catholic Church. Controlled, managed by the Catholic Church, although the state pays the fees. And at secondary level, it's not quite that high, but it is way in a majority. Now, what we have here is a school system that is absolutely silent or teaches, according to the Pope, that not only, you know, we all know the teaching of homosexuality, but in the last document by the Pope, he teaches that while tolerating evil, that's us, is one thing, but to legislate for evil, civil partnership, would be intolerable. So now, drilling down on this, and for our young people, we have people in our school system, all the children of Ireland, in a school system controlled, and these children are being taught that this actually is evil. Now, what I want to know is, and I affirm and confirm the great achievement related to civil partnership, I want to know, is it our responsibility as a community to take on some of these fundamental contradictions? Because if we are celebrating and moving forward a success for our community in this state, there is an extraordinarily powerful historic institution who, hand in glove with our state, wrote the Constitution. Anybody that studies our history knows that. Who continue to this moment having that influence. And I'll end with a story. My godchild in 5th year, 16 years of age, wrote her proposal for transition year that she wanted to do her year project on freedom to marry, on marriage equality. She put that to the class teacher, 120 were in this overall year. She was publicly humiliated when the feedback came to her overall class, and she was told, don't you know that Catholics believe this is evil? And absolutely not. This person threw aside her project. Now, it's quite important that we understand the depth of what we're dealing with here. And I just would love, because what I'm interested here, having lived in the state of Massachusetts over 6 years, Boston went for marriage and got it. Boston is often talked about in the state of Massachusetts as quite a Catholic place. So perhaps you just do a little comparative analysis.
Right. Well, I think it's cases like yours and the work you all have done that, despite the opposition of the hierarchy and some of the forces you just, rightly described, are winning. I mean, they didn't like civil partnership either. They didn't want you to have anything. They didn't want you to have any acknowledgement. They probably, I don't know for sure, but I'd be willing to bet, opposed decriminalization as well. And so despite the forces you're describing and the situation you're describing, you're the ones that are making the case, that are reaching past the structures of inequality to reach people and touch their hearts and minds and educate and change them and immobilize them. And you've made such tremendous progress. You undoubtedly will continue to be able to do that should you put your mind to it. And the story you just told is the kind of shocking, appalling story that if I were you, I'd be telling that story throughout Ireland. Is this the way parents want their kids to be taught? Is this the proper structure? Is this the proper way that we humiliate our children if they don't want to look down on people who are different from them? And I think you will win that argument. And so, and I'm saying you, but we're doing the same thing, and we have the same battles back at home with much of the same opposition. So I hear everything you're describing as unquestionably the challenges, and you described a particular legal structural challenge that you have that we don't formally have, even though we have the weight of the problem. And yet, we are the ones who are winning. The majority of Catholics, according to polling in the United States, support the freedom to marry. Clearly, given the polling in Ireland, the majority of Catholics in Ireland support the freedom to marry. So I take the challenge you're talking about, but I see that we're the ones who have the better case, the better truth, and the better momentum, and we should just keep at it.
Have we any more questions?
I just have one question. Just again, to return to the religion question, the church is in a relatively somewhat weakened state here morally because of the abuse and so on and so forth. But one of the things that I keep hearing is this sort of relativist argument that secularism is now another religion, and so we're now just supposed to choose supermarket-wise between formal religions and secularism where it doesn't fit their bill. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that it makes a lot of sense to get sidetracked into semantic arguments about secularism and so on, when what I would put our emphasis on is talking about what's real here and what's really at stake. We're talking about real people. We're talking about real Irish families. They have personal stories in the same way that Anne-Louise just gave one. Put names on it. Talk about people. Talk about fairness. we don't have to have an argument about religion. We're not trying to tell people what their religion should be. What we're appealing to is values. Values of justice and love and commitment and equality and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and the golden rule of treating others as you want to be treated. And whether people are secular or religious, most of them profess those same values, and most fair-minded people have those values. And so it's not an argument about religion, it's an argument about values and where those values lead. And even more than an argument, it's an engagement that gives people the real stuff that will touch their hearts and help them get to the right place. And that stuff is the kind of story you just told, the kind of personal stories that you've been telling, the names, the faces, the injustices, the inadequacies of civil partnership, the way in which people are still vulnerable, the way in which when we move to marriage in a place like Massachusetts or Catholic Spain, doesn't hurt anyone. All the things that the opponents claim are going to happen haven't happened. No locusts, no floods, no catastrophes. And you know what? People are smart enough, they've been through enough of that scare rhetoric here in Ireland as in the United States, that if we give them the reason, the emotional and then logical reasons to rise to fairness, the majority do. And you've proven that. So I really focus on not all the terrible things we have to face, which, we have a lot of stuff we're all dealing with, some of which we're familiar with and some of which are coming about from this new economic climate and the economic meltdown, and that puts pressure on people and adds to the anxiety that makes them less generous. Those are things we have to deal with. Those are the challenges we have in our work. But I see through that the fact that we are winning. We are reaching people. We're helping them rise to fairness by making our case and by telling our stories. And if we just keep our eye on that and keep at it, Ireland will get there hopefully really soon, because we need you as a further argument for why the United States can get there as well.
We'll just take one more question.
I just noticed in your talk, one thing that you didn't focus upon or speak about, although you made a couple of references to fundamental rights and you made a reference to human rights. This question just asked you about moral codes, etc. But there's sort of a framework, a human rights framework, which is global. The church, the Christian churches, the Muslim churches, etc., all come together in the international fora of the UN, hand in hand, to argue their cases and to make, to exert pressure upon the liberal world, shall we say. But you haven't spoken at all, and it's really interesting to me, about the language of human rights. You've spoken about a legal advocacy, and you've spoken about a public awareness advocacy. But you haven't spoken about the terms through which, the lens, if you like. You talk about decency, you talk about fairness.
Right.
You haven't talked about the framework at all. And I'm wondering, I follow very closely what happens in the US, and I looked at Fred Olson's stuff for Proposition 8 in California, and he lent entirely this Republican, this like shocking Republican did what he did for Bush put into place. But a very man of clearly of some integrity, because what he argued on was a complete human rights framework, and he like yourself, he spoke about what happened with the 16 states, etc. in 1967. I'm just wondering what your take on that is. Do you argue from a human rights perspective? Do you use the conventions? Do you speak about the right to education and demands? Do you advocate the intercardiac principles, which lay out, etc., etc., etc.?
Right. Well, first of all, the United States is, in general, much less progressive and attentive to some of the arguments and cases and conventions, the Yogyakarta principles and so on that you just described. We wouldn't get very far in the United States by invoking European human rights doctrine and the momentum in the European court and so on, and the conventions, which are obviously all tools that you have, that you absolutely should and have and must continue to make use of. Sorry?
The UN?
Yeah, again, I'm not defending this, I'm just describing it. The United States is not as attuned to those good conventions, arguments, and appeals. That's not to say there's never any place for inserting it into a court case, but you may have, it sounds like you've done a lot of reading, you may have seen there's a huge backlash attack on the part of, to use a word that I said I shouldn't, on the part of right-wing forces condemning judges for even referring to anything that happens in another country or invoking international law as an example. I mean, that's that terrain that we're dealing with when it comes to the legal part. Okay, so that's one distinction between what you have at your disposal and the way we would make a court case or make a legal argument to a political figure. But having said that, I think the more important answer to your question is that absolutely we should be talking about human rights, about the Constitution, about the meaning of a free society, and all those things that I think I did reference and would absolutely, if I were arguing in court, would certainly be in the brief and along with law and case law and all those kinds of things. But my view is that, in general, courts have to be made, like anyone else, to want to get to the right place. And then the legal roadmap you give them should be as rich and strong as what you're invoking and what I would agree with. That those are not, I don't really think, actually the primary, and they're certainly not the only arguments or reasons we get judges to do the right thing. First, they really have to understand the human dimension, the emotion, the values, the sense of history, and then they follow, hopefully, a legal roadmap if we also give them the courage and the protection to believe they can follow that legal roadmap. And when you step out of court, because most of our work is not just about the judges. We have good lawyers doing important cases, and you have them, we have them. That will continue. You have good lobbying groups and good organizations like Marriage Equality and Glenn and others who will make the right mix of legal and political arguments to the legal and political actors in the Doyle and elsewhere. But the overarching work is the work of creating the understanding and the desire to do the right thing, the understanding that this needs to change and that there's a moral imperative and an emotional and personal urgency to making that change. And that comes, I think, not from legal arguments or rights-based arguments, right as they are and much as they appeal to people like you and me. That comes from the personal, the cases, the stories, the families, and the values that I described earlier. And another way of saying that is the rights-based case gets us to 40%, 45%, maybe in Ireland 50%. But what we're also trying to do is get that next 5, 10, 15, 20%. And they're not going to get there just on the strength of the Geneva Convention or the UN framework or the US Constitution or the Magna Carta. Or they're going to get there because you touch their heart. And that's where I would put the bulk of the energy, even while smart insider work is being done through our organizations to finish the job and clinch the deal and write the case and write the brief and write the legislation.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. I'd like to thank you all for coming along today, and thank you to Marriage Equality and the NRGF for inviting Evan for a very informative and thought-provoking early afternoon. And finally, to thank Evan himself for coming along. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.